Welcome to the Fairy Frequency channel. Tonight I'll be reading to you from a very creepy book called Ghosts and Ghastlies. This is a collection of stories that were gathered together by Helen Hoke. And if you've missed any of the previous chapters of this very, very spooky book, you can find them in an original playlist titled Ghosts and Ghastlies. Tonight's chapter is an apparition. This story was originally written by Nut Hampson. Maybe that's Newt Hampson, in which a young boy playing in a churchyard finds a tooth and then takes it home in his pocket. That night, a strange apparition comes to collect it. Several years of my childhood were spent with my uncle at the vicarage in Norland. It was a hard time for me, much work, much thrashing, and seldom, if ever, a time for play and amusement. My uncle was so strict with me that little by little, it became my only joy to slip away and be alone. If I occasionally had a free hour, I slipped into the woods, or went up to the churchyard and wandered among the graves and the crosses, dreaming, thinking, and talking aloud to myself. The vicarage had an exceptionally beautiful site along the Glimma, a river wide and boulder-strewn. Day and night its voice sounded. At one time of the day, Glimma moved south, at another time north, according to the ebb and the flow of the tide. But unceasingly its eternal song murmured, and its waters moved with the same haste summer or winter, whatever path it took. The church and the churchyard were on a hill. The building was an old frame chapel built in the form of a cross. The churchyard was without care of any sort, and always without flowers on the graves. But over near this stone wall were wont to grow the most luscious raspberries, a large and juicy fruit that drew nourishment from the rich mould below. I knew every grave and every inscription, and many a cross that I saw set up knew. In time began to learn, and at last, on a stormy night, toppled over. But if there were no flowers on the graves, there was a luxuriant growth of grass over the entire churchyard. It was so tall and so coarse that I often sat there listening to the wind that soughed through the very hard growth and reached to my waist. Often in the midst of this sighing, the weathercock on the steeple of the church swung about, and the rasp of the rusty iron sounded complainingly over the whole vicarage plot. It was as if the spit of iron was cutting its teeth against another piece of iron. When the sexton was working, I often talked to him. He was a serious fellow who seldom smiled, but he was very friendly to me, and he stood casting up the earth from the grave he was digging. He would often warn me to be gone, for now he had on his spade a large thigh bone, or a grinning skull. I often found on the graves bits of bones that I had always put back into the earth again, as the sexton had taught me. I was so used to this that I felt no abhorrence in coming upon these human relics. Under one end of the church was a burial cellar where masses of bones lay scattered, and in this vault I sat many an hour, hammering on something or making varied designs on the floor with the mouldering bones. But one day I found a tooth in the churchyard. It was a front tooth, strong and of brilliant white. Without giving myself any reason for it, I put the tooth into my pocket. I would use it for something, file it into some sort of design, and inlay it into one of the many wonderful things I made of wood. I took the tooth home with me. It was autumn, and dusk came early. I had one and another thing to do, and probably 2 hours passed before I went into the kitchen to work on the tooth. In the meantime, the moon, half full, had arisen. There was no light in the kitchen, and I was quite alone. I did not dare to light the lamps because the beetles would come, but I could manage with the light from the vent in the stove when I got a good fire going. So I went into the shed for wood. The shed was dark. While I was fumbling for the wood, I felt a light blow, as from a single finger on my head. I turned about hastily, but I saw no one. I thrashed about me with my arms, but felt no one. I called, asking if anyone were there, but I received no answer. I was bareheaded. I reached up to the spot on my head where I had been struck, and against my hand I felt something so icy cold that I immediately relaxed my hold. How strange that is, I thought. I reached again toward my hair. The chill had disappeared. I thought, what can it be that has fallen from the roof and struck me on the head? I took an armful of wood and went into the kitchen, fired the stove, and waited until the light came from the vent. Then I took out the tooth and the file. There was the sound of the knocking on the window. I looked up. Beyond the window, with his face pressed close to the pane, stood a man. He was a stranger to me. I did not know him, although I knew everyone in the parish. He had a full red beard and a red scarf about his throat, and a sou'wester on his head. What I did not think of then, but what occurred to me later, was this. How could this be? How could his head appear to me so clearly in the dark, even from a part of the house where not even the half moon was shining? I saw the face with an appalling clearness. It was pale, almost white, and its eyes were staring right at me. A minute went by. Then the man began to smile. It was no audible, stirring laughter, but the mouth opened wide, and the eyes continued to stare as before, but the man smiled. I dropped what I had in my hands and trembled from my head to foot. In the ugly gap of the leering face outside the window pane, I suddenly saw a yawning space in the row of teeth. A tooth was missing. I sat and stared before me in agony. Another minute went by. The face began to change color. It became deeply green, then deeply red, but the smile remained fixed. I was not unconscious. I could know everything about me. The fire burned quite clearly in the vent to the stove and cast a pale glow even to the stairway at the opposite wall. I could also hear, within the maid's room on the other side of the wall, a clock ticking. I saw everything so clearly that I even noticed that the sou'wester that the man outside the window wore was a rusty black in the crown, but had a green brim. Then the man lowered his head down along the pane, very slowly, farther and farther down, and at last he was below the window. It was as if he glided into the ground. I could no longer see him. My fright was terrible. I began to shiver. I slipped to the floor to find the tooth, but at the same time I did not dare to take my eyes from the window, lest the face should again appear. When I had found the tooth, I would have taken it back at once to the churchyard, but I didn't dare to. I continued to sit alone. I could not move. I heard steps out in the yard, and I saw one of the maid servants come clattering along in her wooden shoes, but I did not dare to call to her, and the steps went past. An eternity passed. The fire began to burn out in the stove. No rescue appeared for me. Then I clenched my teeth together and I arose. I opened the door and moved backwards, out of the scullery, constantly gazing toward the window where the man had stood. When I came out into the yard, I took to my heels to the stable, where I would find one of the stable boys to go with me to the churchyard, but the boys were not in the stable. In the meantime, I had become bolder, out under the open sky, and I determined to go alone to the churchyard. Moreover, I wished to escape, confiding in someone, and perhaps later find myself in my uncle's clutches and forced to tell him the story. So I went alone up over the hill, carrying the tooth in my pocket handkerchief. Near the gate of the churchyard, I paused. My courage refused to stay with me any longer. I heard the eternal sound of the river, but otherwise all was silent. There was no door in the churchyard portal, only an archway to pass through. I stationed myself anxiously on one side of this archway and thrust my head carefully into its aperture to see if I should advance. Then I sank on my knees in the pathway. A short distance beyond the gate between the graves stood my man with the seaman's hat. He had the same white face, and as he turned it toward me, he beckoned me forward, up into the churchyard. I interpreted this as a command, but I did not dare to go. I lay there a long time and looked at the man. I prayed to him, but he stood there silent. Then something happened that gave me a little courage again. I heard one of the stable boys moving about some task down near the barnyard. This sign of life about me caused me to rise. The man began very slowly to move off. He did not walk, but glided over the graves, beckoning me steadily forward. I stepped inside the gate. The man beckoned me nearer. I took a few steps and stood still. I could go no farther. With a trembling hand, I took the white tooth from my handkerchief and threw it with all my might into the churchyard. At that instant, the iron cock on the church steeple swung around, and its cutting shriek penetrated my bone and marrow. I rushed through the gate and down over the slope homeward. When I came into the scullery, they saw that my face was as white as snow. Many years have passed since then, but I recollect it all. I still see myself kneeling by the gate of the churchyard, and I see the man with the red beard. I cannot even approximate his age. He might have been 20 years, or he might have been 40, as it was not to be the last time I saw him. I thought later about this, but I do not know, even now, what I should say about his age. The man came back many an evening, many a night. He appeared, smiled with a broad grin that showed his missing tooth, and then vanished. The snow came, and I could no longer go up to the churchyard to put the tooth into the earth, and the man continued to come through the entire winter, but at greater intervals. My harrowing fear disappeared, but he made my days very unhappy, beyond measure unhappy. Many times in those days I derived a little joy from thinking that I could end my torture by throwing myself into the Glima at flood tide. Then spring came, and the man vanished altogether. Altogether? No, not wholly, but for the entire summer. The next winter he appeared again. He came only once, then remained away for a long time. 3 years after my first meeting with him, I left Norland and was gone for a year. When I came back, I was confirmed, and I seemed to myself a grown person. I no longer resided with my uncle at the vicarage, but at home with my father and mother. One afternoon in the fall, when I had lain down to sleep, a cold hand was laid on my forehead. I opened my eyes and saw the man before me, seated in a chair by the bed. I was not sleeping alone in the room, but with two of my brothers. I awoke neither of them. When I felt the cold pressure on my forehead, I raised my hands and said, "Go away." My brothers called from their beds and asked to whom I spoke. When the man had sat still for a short time, he began to rock back and forth with his body. While doing this, he began to rise, until at last he swayed almost up to the ceiling, and when it appeared that he could go no farther, he rose fully and glided with lifeless steps over the floor, away from my bed, to the stove, where he vanished. He had never been so near to me as then. I had looked directly into his face. His glance was vacant, yet sly. He looked at me, but as if past me, right through me, far off to another world. I noticed that he had gray eyes. He did not move his features. He did not smile. When I shoved his hand from my forehead and said, "Go away," he drew his hand away slowly. During all the time he sat by my bed, he did not blink his eyes. A few months later, when winter had come and I had left home again, I lived for a time at the house of a merchant, Mr. W., whom I helped in the shop and in the office. Here I was to meet my man for the last time. I went up to my room one evening, lighted the lamp, and undressed. As usual, I was going to set my shoes out for the boy to clean, and taking them in my hand, I opened the door. There he stood in the corridor, directly before me, that red-bearded man. I knew that there were persons in the adjoining rooms, so I wasn't afraid. I mumbled audibly, "Are you here again?" A moment later the man opened his large mouth and began to smile. This no longer made an agonizing impression on me, But this time I became more attentive. The missing tooth had come back to its place. Perhaps someone had put it down into the ground, or perhaps through the years it had managed to crumble, to disintegrate, to become one with the dust from which it had become separated. God only knows. The man closed his mouth, but I still stood in the doorway. He turned around and went down the stairway, at the foot of which he vanished. I have never seen him again, and many years have passed since then. This man, the red-bearded messenger from the land of death, has, with this inexpressible horror that he brought into my childhood, done me much harm. I have had more than one vision since then, more than one strange encounter with the inexplicable, but nothing has impressed me so strongly as this. Yet perhaps he has not done me only harm. This has often occurred to me. I could believe that he was one of the first reasons why I learned to clench my teeth and to harden myself. In later life, I have certainly had need for that. That's the end of An Apparition. So remember, if you've missed any of the previous chapters of this very, very creepy book, you can find them in our original playlist titled Ghosts and Ghastlies. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. Wish you all a beautiful evening. Sweet dreams, everyone.